3 minutes. That's all it took to unravel decades of royal silence. As Catherine appeared on national television, millions watched the future queen crumble in real time. Tears streamed down her face, her voice cracked, and then came the words no one expected. What was supposed to be a charity segment turned into the most devastating royal reveal in modern history. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What began as a gentle conversation about children's welfare suddenly twisted into something the palace had never anticipated, and certainly never approved. Catherine's hands trembled as she tried to answer a simple question about the pressures of public life, but her voice faltered before she even reached the end of the sentence. There was something raw in her expression, something that broke through the perfected image she had carried for over a decade, something that felt like a cry for help disguised as an interview. Then came that chilling pause, the kind that makes everyone watching hold their breath before she uttered cryptic phrases about being silenced, isolated, and betrayed. No context, no clarity, just words heavy enough to pierce through the sterile atmosphere of the TV studio and land like shockwaves across the world. Producers panicked, cameras scrambled, red lights flashed as the control room fought to contain the unfolding disaster. The interviewer, completely unprepared, tried to steady the conversation, but his face revealed what millions were thinking. Something was deeply, disturbingly wrong. Catherine's gaze wandered, her breaths uneven, as if she were fighting a battle between her duty and her breaking point. When her voice cracked again, the room felt like it froze in time. She whispered a line that made the interviewer's eyes widen, and before he could probe further, the broadcast cut abruptly to a commercial. But by then, the damage was irreversible. Within minutes, social media platforms exploded, and Number Catherine crisis surged to the top of global trends. Clips of her trembling hands and quivering voice circulated like wildfire. Comment sections filled with panic, sympathy, and growing fury directed at the palace. People demanded answers, and the media machine, normally precise and guarded, was suddenly fractured and scrambling. News networks replayed the clip on a loop. Experts speculated about her cryptic words, and insiders began whispering that this wasn't a momentary lapse, it was the culmination of months of silent suffering. Catherine's vulnerability had cracked open a hidden world of tension, and the public sensed it instantly. The facade of the perfect royal life was slipping, revealing something far more troubling underneath. The world watched and waited, but deep down, everyone sensed the same truth. What Catherine said next, or perhaps what she tried to say, would shake the monarchy to its core, because everything about her collapse felt intentional, a message forced through desperation rather than choice, a warning wrapped in tears. But what Catherine whispered just before the broadcast cut to black would ignite a scandal the palace could never contain. For years, she smiled for the cameras, but behind the palace walls, Catherine was living a different story, one of control, suppression, and emotional torment. Her breakdown wasn't spontaneous. It was the result of something far darker. She had been stripped of her voice, her freedom, even her children's access, until she couldn't take it anymore. The collapse, witnessed by millions, didn't begin on that stage. It began in the shadows, long before the world ever suspected a thing. Over the past year, Catherine's appearances had grown alarmingly rare, each more choreographed than the last. Royal watchers noticed subtle changes: the scripted tone of her speeches, the forced smiles, the eerie silence when asked unscripted questions. Behind the scenes, palace aides had reportedly tightened their grip, ensuring Catherine remained compliant, composed, and contained. Calls were monitored, staff she trusted suddenly reassigned. Invitations she used to receive never arrived. It was a slow, calculated erasure disguised as royal protocol. Even her closest friends began to vanish from her orbit. One longtime confidant, speaking anonymously, claimed she hadn't seen or spoken to Catherine in over 9 months, not because of a falling out, but because access had been cut. Locked away behind the palace's ornate gates, Catherine began keeping detailed journals, handwritten entries that chronicled her unraveling mental state. entries that would later be leaked in fragments to a sympathetic member of Parliament. In them, she wrote of the overwhelming loneliness, the growing fear, and the sense that she was being watched, not protected. The most chilling line read simply, "Even the nursery feels cold now." It was that remark that led to explosive speculation. Had the palace interfered with her time with her own children? Whispers soon emerged of scheduled visits, supervised interactions, even unapproved nanny rotations. Catherine's maternal instincts, once praised by the public, were now being questioned behind closed doors. Her every move dissected, every deviation punished. It was a battle not just for dignity, but for motherhood itself. And through it all, she was expected to smile, be graceful, be perfect. But the mask finally slipped. And when it did, it wasn't a collapse, it was an eruption. The royal fairy tale had always depended on silence. But Catherine's pain had become too loud to ignore. The palace, for all its protocols, had underestimated one thing: her breaking point. And the moment she crossed it, she took with her the illusion of royal harmony. But while Catherine's pain played out on screen, the real puppeteers operated in the shadows, and their motives were far from royal. Everyone thinks the king rules, but what if the true power lies elsewhere? Behind the polished portraits and state dinners lies a hidden network, a clandestine circle of advisors, enforcers, and shadow monarchs whose influence eclipses even the crown. Catherine's emotional unraveling may have just exposed the invisible monarchy. For decades, they've been known only as whispers, the men in grey suits. Unnamed, unphotographed, and untouched by elections, these senior courtiers and legacy power brokers have shaped the palace from within, ensuring the crown's continuity at any cost. They survive not by being seen, but by controlling those who are. It was into this unseen hierarchy that Catherine unknowingly stepped, not as a royal, but as a variable to be managed. The smiling Duchess was no longer just a wife or mother, she was a potential disruption, a figure who dared to evolve publicly, connect deeply, and speak authentically. And that terrified them. When Catherine pushed for real transparency in public engagements, when she questioned rehearsed lines, resisted wearing recycled symbolism, and asked to address mental health with brutal honesty, it wasn't seen as refreshing. It was seen as insubordination. Senior aides who once nodded politely began reporting her directly to the inner circle. Her attempts to shape her image were quietly overridden, her speeches edited, and press strategies rewritten without her consent. She wasn't just being managed, she was being dismantled. Intelligence units within the royal institution, yes, they exist, began discreetly monitoring her digital activity. Calls were logged, messages scanned, allies flagged, and when her conversations with progressive charities began gaining traction outside the palace's media arm, warnings were issued. She was told to remain within the family's defined tone. But the deeper issue wasn't tone, it was power. Within the palace, there was a growing divide. The old guard, desperate to preserve legacy and control, saw Catherine's emotional authenticity as a virus. But a younger, reformist faction believed she represented the future of the monarchy if only she were allowed to be real. That internal civil war had been simmering quietly, but Catherine's rising popularity tipped the scale. The more the public adored her, the more urgent the need became to restrain her influence. That's when the retaliation began. Her most trusted private secretary was removed. Her calendar was gutted. Charitable initiatives she personally backed were suddenly delayed or cancelled. Every attempt to regain narrative control was met with a cold and clinical slapdown. Behind every no, there was someone pulling strings. Behind every silence, someone enforcing it. It wasn't the king, it wasn't the institution, it was the system that lives between the two, the faceless, unelected power that has outlasted monarchs and ministers alike. Catherine wasn't just fighting tradition. She was fighting a ghost state. And the price of that rebellion would come in the form of emotional exile, public collapse, and a brutal reckoning she never expected. And at the center of this cold machinery stood one man, the architect of her silence, rarely photographed, never quoted, yet feared by every royal insider. Lord Alistair Blackwood, officially head of protocol, unofficially the palace's most ruthless fixer. Catherine's on-air collapse wasn't just emotional. It was the desperate act of a woman cornered by a man who'd silenced dozens before her. Blackwood didn't just maintain protocol, he weaponized it. He wasn't born into nobility, but he clawed his way into the monarchy's bloodstream through absolute loyalty and utter discretion. Over 3 decades, he earned a reputation as the cleaner of royal scandals affairs, leaks, backroom deals, even hush payments, all sanitized and buried under his watch. He became indispensable. Kings and queens came and went, but Blackwood endured. When Catherine entered the royal family, he saw her not as a threat, but as an asset to mold. For a while, she played the role he assigned her, but the moment she began questioning orders, modifying speeches, and refusing dress codes chosen by handlers, she triggered alarms. Wardrobe, after all, was not about fashion, it was about message control. When Catherine abandoned certain traditional pieces for more modern or personal attire, Blackwood saw defiance. And defiance had a cost. Her scheduling was quietly cut back. Her team reshuffled. Public appearances rearranged to minimize solo impact. All of it orchestrated with a surgical coldness that only he could deliver. And then came the whispers, Catherine's strange turn of phrase during a press briefing. "I've learned how the Black Hand moves quietly." It seemed poetic at the time, until insiders revealed that the Black Hand was palace slang for Lord Blackwood's influence. After that, everything escalated. Her key staff members either resigned abruptly or were reassigned without notice. One former aide, who leaked emails detailing manipulated press releases, vanished from the public eye days later. No follow-up, no explanation, just silence. Blackwood's genius wasn't in open confrontation, it was in erasure. Catherine knew that. And by the time she broke down on live television, she wasn't just reacting to pressure. She was sending a warning. She had been outmaneuvered, cornered, and publicly dismantled by a man whose name barely appeared in public records. Her power had been shattered, not by scandal or public failure, but by an internal force operating without oversight or accountability. And yet, the most tragic consequence wasn't professional, it was personal. Because as she waged this invisible war against a man who represented the cold machinery of monarchy, Catherine wasn't just battling shadows, she was losing her grip on the one ally who mattered most: William. What happened to William and Catherine, the fairy tale couple? Behind closed doors, their marriage had become a war zone, not of infidelity, but of loyalty. As palace forces tightened their grip, William was forced to choose: protect the institution or protect the woman he loved. And Catherine feared he had made his choice. For months, the public sensed something was off. Their once warm glances turned stiff, their synchronized smiles replaced by cold, deliberate expressions that felt mechanical rather than affectionate. Body language experts dissected every frame of their appearances, pointing out how William often stepped ahead, how Catherine's eyes seemed distant, and how their hands, once intertwined effortlessly, now hovered inches apart, as if united only by obligation. Behind those carefully curated moments, Catherine's doubt deepened. She began to believe that William wasn't just being distant, he was being pressured, and not subtly. Rumors swirled that senior aides, including Blackwood himself, had pulled William into private strategy sessions, warning him of reputational disasters should Catherine continue pushing against the established order. Every time William avoided answering her pointed questions, every time he returned from a meeting looking defeated, her fears grew sharper. He was choosing the crown over their marriage. The tension seeped into every public event. During a charity gala, Catherine was said to have whispered something to William that made him turn abruptly away. At a remembrance service, William stood rigid as Catherine wiped a discreet tear. The pair, who once radiated unity, had become symbols of emotional fracture, their silence speaking louder than words ever could. It wasn't long before insiders whispered about intercepted conversations between William and Blackwood, conversations Catherine was never meant to know about. Allegedly, William was told that supporting her emotional independence would destabilize the monarchy. If he sided with her, they warned, the consequences would not be confined to headlines. They would ripple into the very future of the crown he was destined to inherit. When Catherine confronted him in private, the exchange was reportedly explosive. She accused him of betrayal, not of unfaithfulness, but of surrendering their marriage to the palace machine. William, caught between his role and his humanity, could offer no reassurance strong enough to undo the damage. And the breaking point finally arrived during a closed-door family summit, a meeting meant to restore order. Instead, it shattered William. Insiders described him leaving the room pale, shaken, and unable to speak, as though the demands placed upon him had become too heavy to bear. Catherine saw this collapse, and for the first time realized her own unraveling was pulling him under too. Their love story, once the monarchy's greatest asset, had been twisted into a duckled battlefield. And just when it seemed Catherine had lost the only ally she had left, fate brought an unexpected figure back into the spotlight. But as their bond fractured, one unlikely figure stepped into the chaos, shattering all expectations. The woman once labelled a royal villain emerged as an unlikely saviour. When Meghan Markle returned to London in the midst of the crisis, jaws dropped. Was she there to gloat or to help? What followed was an explosive confrontation and a shocking act of sisterhood that no one could have predicted. It was less than 24 hours after Catherine's televised breakdown when Meghan was spotted arriving at Heathrow under an alias. The tabloids lost their minds. Was this calculated? Opportunistic? The palace immediately dismissed her return as a private visit, but insiders knew better. Meghan had come with purpose and a message. For years, the narrative had painted them as rivals, competing duchesses, polar opposites. But behind the headlines was a silence both women had endured. And in Catherine's moment of collapse, Meghan saw something she recognized too well. A woman being consumed by an institution that demanded perfection and punished humanity. Arrangements were made in secret. A secured estate in the countryside became the site of a private, emotionally charged meeting between the two women. No aides, no cameras, no palace interference. What was said in those hours remains tightly guarded, but sources close to both camps revealed that Catherine handed Meghan a handwritten letter. It was dated nearly a year before Meghan and Harry's departure, and it contained something astonishing, an apology. Catherine had reportedly written, "I should have stood up for you. I knew what they were doing, and I let it happen. I'm sorry." That letter had never been sent, but now, in the middle of her own storm, Catherine finally delivered it. And Meghan didn't walk away. The two women, once symbols of division, began working together in secret. And just days later, they made their move. A joint video appeared online, bypassing official royal channels. It featured Catherine and Meghan seated side by side, united in tone and message. They spoke of silence, fear, and the impossible standards placed upon women in public life, particularly within the monarchy. The video was unfiltered, unsanctioned, and unapologetic. It broke the internet. The palace was blindsided. For the first time, it wasn't an outside journalist or rogue staffer. It was two royal women, from within, exposing the fractures of the crown. Senior courtiers reportedly called it an act of defiance. Others called it courage. Either way, it was war. The royal institution had tolerated dissent before, but never coordinated rebellion. And this time, the rebels were not fringe, they were central figures. As the world reeled from their alliance, the palace took its most ruthless step, yet initiating the operation they swore never to use. She became too powerful, too beloved, too dangerous. So the palace initiated a plan codenamed Silent Swan. The objective: erase Catherine from public influence without drawing blood. And they almost succeeded. Almost. Until one royal insider couldn't take it anymore and leaked everything. What began as whispers of concern soon revealed itself to be a calculated psychological campaign designed not to exile Catherine physically, but to discredit her emotionally. Silent Swan wasn't a myth, it was a blueprint. Months before her on-air collapse, subtle shifts began. Her public engagements were slashed with no explanation. Causes she had championed for years were suddenly under review. Her smiling portraits disappeared from press briefings, replaced by carefully worded statements issued in her name, but never in her voice. The media, usually obsessed with her every outfit and glance, grew strangely quiet. It wasn't a coincidence. Leaked internal memos showed that royal media liaisons had been instructed to de-escalate coverage and focus on broader institutional themes. In translation, make her vanish softly. The pressure wasn't just external. Inside the palace, she was surrounded by smiles with sharpened edges. Conversations were monitored, staff turnover increased. She was told she was too emotional to lead, too public to manage, too popular to control. And when public concern began to bubble, the PR machine stepped in not to protect her, but to confuse the narrative. Conflicting stories about her health began circulating. One claimed she was exhausted, another hinted at postnatal depression, another still suggested marital strain, but none of them came from Catherine herself. That was the point. Silence her long enough, and eventually people forget what her voice sounded like. But the monarchy miscalculated. Deep within the royal operation, a staff member, a longtime aide turned whistleblower, had been documenting everything. Meeting notes, drafted scripts, a digital folder labeled Swan Protocol. And one day, with a single encrypted email, the entire operation was exposed. The documents landed on the desk of a senior MP. The contents were damning. Catherine hadn't stepped back from public life, she'd been pushed. Her absence wasn't a choice, it was an orchestration. And what the monarchy failed to anticipate was that Catherine wasn't done fighting. She responded not with a press statement, but with power. In a bold and unprecedented move, she submitted a sealed affidavit to Parliament, formally testifying to the psychological warfare she had endured at the hands of the institution she had once vowed to represent. The silence they had imposed on her shattered beneath the weight of truth. Silent Swan was no longer a secret. It was a scandal with a name and a trail. And while the palace desperately tried to contain the fallout, Catherine had already set the next domino in motion, one that would take this crisis beyond palaces and parliaments and into the legal heart of the nation. But even as the palace scrambled to suppress the fire, a greater reckoning was approaching, a reckoning written not in tabloids, but in law. What happens when the monarchy breaks its own rules? For the first time in modern British history, Parliament launched an official inquiry into royal misconduct. Testimonies, leaked documents, and a growing public outcry put the very structure of the monarchy on trial, and Catherine's voice echoed in every chamber. It began as whispers of outrage, but quickly turned into a movement. Petitions flooded parliamentary inboxes, each signature a demand for justice. Within days, over 2 million citizens had added their names, forcing lawmakers to confront what had long been considered untouchable. The palace had hoped the fury would fade, that public memory would be short, but it wasn't. The broadcast, the leaked files, and the silence from the royal family had created a vacuum that only truth could fill. MPs debated late into the night, with some arguing that a line had been crossed, that the monarchy, though steeped in tradition, was not above scrutiny. Others, loyal to the old guard, insisted the crown must remain beyond political reach. But when the vote came, it passed. Narrowly, shockingly, Parliament would investigate the monarchy. And behind closed doors, those who had once feared speaking out began to speak with fire. Former aides submitted confidential testimony outlining how Catherine was systematically sidelined. They described a culture of paranoia, controlled environments, and psychological games designed to destabilize. Her personal calls monitored, her health misrepresented, her relationships sabotaged. But it was what came next that shattered the illusion of royal dignity. A confidential package was delivered to the committee, hand-sealed and marked with a royal crest. It contained a pre-recorded video. Catherine's face appeared on screen unfiltered, unpolished, and unmistakably resolute. In that video, she spoke not as a duchess or future queen, but as a woman betrayed by the institution she once vowed to uphold. Her words pierced the room. I believed in this family. I believed in the oath. But no oath should cost someone their voice, their children, or their peace. When the footage ended, the chamber reportedly sat in stunned silence. The weight of her truth was undeniable. The inquiry, once considered symbolic, had suddenly become real. Debates turned vicious. Royalists accused reformists of undermining national stability. Reformers fired back, declaring that silence was complicity. News channels aired wall-to-wall coverage. Talk shows, op-eds, and international commentators all joined the fray. And as the firestorm grew, the palace launched its own emergency strategy, issuing vague public statements about compassion, reflection, and renewed commitment. But the damage had already been done. The firm, once thought to be impenetrable, was now vulnerable in a way it had never been before. And even as Parliament prepared for a historic final vote, something bigger stirred beyond the chamber doors. A tidal wave of emotion was building, and it would not be controlled by procedure or protocol. Because what Parliament had only begun to question, the people were already ready to answer. But long before Parliament could vote, it was the people who would make the final judgment in a moment that redefined history. She may never wear the crown, but in the hearts of the people, she already reigns. In the aftermath of her collapse and the chaos that followed, Catherine's bravery sparked something unstoppable. Across the world, millions stood behind her, forcing the monarchy to confront its darkest truths. This is how Catherine became the people's queen. It began with silence. Not from the palace, but from the people holding candles in the rain, outside royal gates, from school children laying down flowers with handwritten notes, from murals splashed across brick walls in cities from Birmingham to Belfast, each one capturing her pain, her resilience, her resistance. Then came the noise. Vigils turned into rallies. Petitions became protests. And slowly, the institution that had remained untouchable for generations felt the ground beneath it begin to shake. The palace could no longer hide behind silence. Forced into the spotlight it so desperately tried to avoid, the royal family released a carefully worded statement, acknowledging past missteps and pledging to reflect with humility. But the timing was transparent. They weren't leading, they were reacting, and by then, the people had already crowned their own. Catherine didn't vanish after the chaos. She stepped forward. For the first time in weeks, she appeared in public standing beside William. He looked broken. She looked reborn. The two walked hand in hand, not as a royal couple, but as two human beings who had weathered something unspeakable. William's eyes, misted with emotion, met the press for a moment that needed no words. And in that unspoken truth came reconciliation not just between a husband and wife, but between Catherine and the institution that had tried to erase her. Days later, the walls truly began to crumble. Lord Blackwood, once feared and untouchable, resigned under pressure. An internal investigation was launched into his conduct, including his role in Silent Swan. Whistleblowers who once whispered in corners now spoke openly before tribunals. And Catherine, she delivered one final message, live, unfiltered, a national television address seen by more than 70 million people across the globe. She didn't cry, she didn't accuse, she simply told the truth, about what it means to lose your voice, about what it costs to take it back. And as she ended with the words, "This isn't about royalty, it's about dignity," the world erupted. But perhaps the most profound change wasn't inside the palace, it was outside of it. Polls showed a seismic shift in public opinion. A new generation of Britons no longer accepted monarchy as default. They demanded transparency, accountability, humanity. Catherine's pain had become their movement, and her resilience became their revolution. The crown may survive, but it will never rule the same way again. Because Catherine didn't just break down, she broke through. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.